Welcome. This is Business Edge on News Central. I'm Tolulope Adeleru Balogun. Our headline story: China's Belt and Road Initiative. Is debt slowing China's advancement? In the past decade or two, a new force has risen from the East. The new financier of the world, China, has been involved in financing many projects across Africa. But her foot seems to be off the pedal and her deep pockets could be running dry. We'll also touch base with a few stories we're keeping our eyes on with NC4 to watch before we finish the show. Welcome. This is Business Edge. Now, alarm bells are ringing over the series of transport, infrastructure, and economic corridors that have their lifeline from China through Central Asia to Europe and also embracing Africa via the Belt and Road Initiative. Analysts estimate that $1 trillion worth of funding that China promised to invest in mostly developing countries for the Belt and Road Initiative is about 7 times more in real terms than the famous Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was the initiative the U.S. financed to help Europe rebuild after World War II. The BRI was expected to be President Xi Jinping's biggest legacy project. It was originally conceived as a 21st century Silk Road running alongside a maritime Silk Road that would have touched down in Africa at Mombasa in Kenya. Later, the definition became geographically fuzzier and African countries across the continent, including Nigeria and South Africa, signed on. Now, 2 major hindrances have been identified. These are a rising bad debt by BRI borrowers and China's shrinking and increasingly introspective economy. The latter has been aggravated by COVID-19 lockdowns that are forcing Beijing to consolidate and to cut back on new loans while it tries to digest old ones. Now, joining me on Business Edge is Nnamdi Nwizu. He is the co-managing partner at Comercio Partners. Nnamdi, good morning and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us on Business Edge.
It's my pleasure.
All right, so let's look at this and start off with a conversation on risk assessment. So it's definitely a very vital phase when it comes to disbursement of loans. Could China's non-interference policy, could it have impeded the scrutiny that Beijing would have given to African countries in terms of the loans they were seeking? Or do you think Beijing turned a blind eye regarding the viability of many of her debtors?
Well, I think to answer that question, we have to go back a bit to the genesis of the reason behind the BRI initiative, which we know we've seen that that China wants to have a bit of political influence in some of these countries. So to do that, you would have to basically turn a blind eye to certain things. So if you look at the disbursement of loans, yes, you would say they haven't done their proper risk assessment, considering the state of the loans in some of these countries currently. And also, management of the whole process. When they started, the focus was on a few Asian countries, and now they moved it to a number of African countries where they're not really sticking with the original plan. It now seems to be a case of where various African countries come up and decide they need a loan from China, and they go and meet China for the loan. They expect the Chinese to do their due diligence. The Chinese expect the person coming for the loan, the nation coming for the loan, to do their own due diligence. So more or less like passing the buck. And at the end of the day, no one really does a proper risk assessment of some of these things. And a typical example you can see is the case in Sri Lanka with the port and the fact that China has had to take over that port.
Okay, that's interesting in terms of passing the buck of responsibility. Who I'm giving you the money, I should be sure that you're viable for repaying me. You that are borrowing the money, I should be sure that the person I'm borrowing the money from doesn't have any funny annotations in the contract that we sign. But as you said, looking at some of the countries where the dealings have sort of gone sour, it is what it is. Now, Beijing has been noted for not being strict at monitoring the implementation of its loans. And this is something you alluded to in your previous answer answer. It is also being argued that Beijing's focus on being part of the executors, or even sometimes being the main contractor, is actually a ploy to exploit manpower from China to the continent, or to wherever these contracts are, rather than a quality of the project or even ensuring complete implementation. What are your thoughts on these concerns? And these are actually also allegations that have come up in different African countries throughout the course of some of these infrastructure projects in particular.
The issue being that, or rather the idea behind the whole BRI, a big chunk of it, like I mentioned before, talk about political influence. The other is the economic influence. And for this economic influence to work, China would basically want to expand into various African countries, right? And natural to see them insisting that you have Chinese firms play a role in executing most of these projects. We have the rail project going on in Lagos here, right, where we've seen the Chinese firms being the ones handling the project. So a big part of the BRI initiative, beyond getting political influence, economic influence, is also being able to expand. And also it was supposed to be a way of trying to sort of ensure that the projects get implemented. But corruption setting in, you're dealing with a lot of African countries where corruption is almost like a pandemic, and everybody ends up, inflating the actual cost of the projects, turning unviable projects and, sugarcoating them and making them look viable, has basically made a lot of these loans go bad. So China has even struggled to ensure that things that are supposed to be done with regards to loans actually happen. And part of it would also be because we've had quite a bit of kickbacks go on, right, behind the scenes. It now becomes a bit more difficult. By the time you've settled someone with regards to a project that is going to do, it becomes a bit difficult to force the person to actually implement or do the things that you have told them or agreed with them that they're going to do.
Okay, interesting enough. Let's do a bit of a history lesson. Many of us may have read about the Silk Road, but let's take a breakdown quickly on the Belt and Road as it is now. So Belt is short for Silk Road Economic Belt, which refers to the proposed overland routes for road and rail transportation through landlocked Central Asia along the famed historical trade routes of the Western regions, where road is short for 21st Century Maritime Silk Road, which refers to the Indo-Pacific sea routes through Southeast Asia to South Asia, Middle East, and Africa. Now, this actually has also been incorporated into the Chinese constitution. That's the Constitution of the People's Republic of China, and that was in 2017. So some international criticism now that I quickly want us to touch base with. Some observers and skeptics, mainly those who are not participating, and particularly the United States, where this big battle for who's going to be the most powerful economically that has spanned so many years, have interpreted this particular plan to be a Sino-centric international trade network. African countries have been able to go to China because they've gotten loans that we have to jump through hoops to get from the West. We have to do so many other things, and a lot of times we don't get the amounts of money that we're getting from China. In all actuality, many people wonder, what does China gain? Is this really about just a simple trade network that spans all these regions and countries? What really is the gain in this initiative for China?
For China, I would say that, like I said, one, they're trying to ensure that they get to expand their own influence. We've seen economically, they're trying to grow businesses for, or trying to grow, get new businesses for the Chinese firms. Then you also have America that has also started making some inroad into Asia, because everybody seems to believe that that economic growth, right, will come from Asia. So you have Pakistan, India, and a number of other countries where you have the U.S. trying to more or less start to get some inroad into those countries. China, in response,
this conversation on China's Belt and Road Initiative, particularly as it has to do with African countries. It's a conversation that is needed. We know a number of African countries owe multi-million and in some cases multi-billion-dollar loans to China that they've reportedly said are for infrastructure, public works, transportation, building up healthcare systems as well. But is really that the case? What is in it for China? And that's where the conversation was. We'll take a very quick time out. out, or a longer one if necessary. But we'll take a quick time out on Business Edge. We'll be right back. You're still watching Business Edge, and as we've learned in this time, when one technology fails, another takes over. I still have with me co-managing partner for Comercio Partners, Nnamdi Nwizu. Nnamdi, thank you so much for joining us via another medium now so that this conversation can continue. Thank you.
My pleasure.
All right, so right before then, I was asking you again about what China stands to benefit, and you've talked about them expanding their political influence, and that's where, unfortunately, we lost that connection. So can you expand beyond that in terms of what China is looking to benefit, and then, of course, the manpower conversation as well?
Yeah, so you have the U.S., the much touted U.S. pivot to Asia, where you've seen the United States trying to get some influence in Asia as a continent. So the BRI has more or less been China's way of pushing back. And like I mentioned earlier, they started off focusing on Asian countries, right? Before they moved into Africa. So the initial plan was for China to try and exert some influence there. And if you look at it, beneficiaries of this project, more or less, that they've been on, we're talking about almost like 34% of the population of the world. If you're looking at the various countries that have benefited from this, that gives a huge influence to China. If you think about it, whenever they're talking about debt relief now for African countries, China's name is always number one country that pops up, which shows you the amount of influence that they have and they've been able to exert across the globe.
Okay, so also let's look back now. In 2018, China's loans to Africa were about $9 billion, and in 2019 it was between $5 billion to $8 billion, a bit of playing room there. Does this indicate anything where Africa stands in terms of the master plan, the grand plan with the Chinese?
Well, we've seen a bit of pushback from some of the African countries due to the fact that the loans haven't performed well and people have had to more or less, they've taken on white elephant projects.
Yes.
And have been unsuccessful in being able to fully implement those projects. So beyond China slowing down in its loan disbursement, we've also been quite a bit of pushback from the African countries. And we've even had some countries run their election based on anti-China loan sentiments. However, we also know that of recent, China seems to have decided to move into more domestic consumption versus global consumption. So they are trying to move from necessarily selling all their goods globally and offshore to getting local consumption to pick up, which would help with the divide that they have currently in between different regions, where you have one region being poor and the other one being much richer. So they're basically trying to get local domestic consumption to grow across various regions. So their focus is shifting a bit. And also add that to the fact that I've had a few of the loans outperform. So add that all of that would explain why you've seen China's loan disbursements drop a bit.
Okay, interesting. All right, so China says that she's maintaining her social markets economy, which is a mixture of capitalism and social policies. In your estimation, do you think that this is working for China as it is? And can Africa still find a way to benefit from this mix when it comes to investment?
Oh, yes, I definitely think so. So if you're looking at, like I talked about Chinese influence, right? And how Chinese influence is increasing across the globe and across Africa. We've seen them talk about Chinese vaccine for COVID. Things like that would basically help with the social market economy and social policies, even though we know that the Chinese have tried as much as possible not to interfere when it comes to the military side of things of their policy. But given all these loans, would basically ensure that they can have some sort of influence and around not just the market economy, but even also your social policies, where it can carry some weight. If a man gives you money, then definitely he can help decide how more or less you carry out some of your policies.
All right, so let's talk about a few of the things that might be affecting how China is doing the Belt and Road Initiative now. So there have been a few scandals, unfortunately, with the BRI, and I'm just going to talk about a few of those. We have the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which has been scaled back with Pakistan's increasing debt problems, and that was a $62 billion deal or plan. And Myanmar was looking for a major port deal that was slimmed down from $7 billion to $1.3 billion. There was a port in Sri Lanka that garnered global headlines after the government could not repay its loans and granted a state-owned Chinese company a 99-year lease on the port as a form of debt relief. You also have the Malaysian government, with which renegotiated a major rail project as a significantly reduced cost and canceled $3 billion worth of plans to build new pipelines. So when you look at all of these scandals, and then you look at also the fact that China's economy is slowing down, we're definitely going to see a more cautious approach to investment in 2021 and going forward. How do you think Africa needs to deal with that in terms of also renegotiating the terms of payments for many African loans, or even allowing for long-term repayments or debt relief in some sense?
Yes, we've seen China has been in talks with certain countries around debt relief.
Yeah.
Right. And it even started with IMF and G20 and having talks around trying to reduce debt based on the effects of COVID and COVID-ravaged economies globally. Unfortunately, China has not been as forthcoming as most people have expected. They've been a bit quiet, while other countries have been moving quickly and aggressively with regards to loan cuts. We've seen the Paris Club process, basically having talks with various countries. We've seen IMF granting countries grants, but so far we've not seen much come from the Chinese side. They've been in talks with Angola, for instance, around debt relief, but till today, people are still waiting for some major announcements. We heard what they're proposing is a suspension of debt payments for a couple of years. But China has not actually come out to grant a lot of these countries debt relief. And you can understand their position. When you have hundreds of billions of dollars out there in debt, once you start grant concessions to a particular country, you more or less set a precedent, and you have other countries all come to meet you, also trying to look for ways in which they would also negotiate their debt. So it's understandable. And if you look at Sri Lanka, where they took over the port, if they were to go ahead and start to give debt to each other people, then a lot of people want to renegotiate terms of the loans, want to reduce the collateral. You've had some countries pledge their crude oil for a few crude oil production for some years, or certain number of barrels per day to China for loan repayments. If you were to negotiate this, considering the fact that crude oil price has come down aggressively, where would that put China, and where would that put its banks that have been granting these loans? So it's a bit of a catch-22. Part of their social policies have to be around also having a humane face and looking at ways to try and help impoverished countries. But at the same time, they need to try and marry that with the fact that they don't want everybody that they've given loans coming to meet them for debt relief, Pakistan and all the other countries.
Yeah. Do you think, in terms of this kind of negotiation, I had a conversation, I think late last week, and someone was saying that one mistake he believes African countries do is that when you want to carry loans from people like China, we should all come to the table as one unit, as an African continent, rather than the various contracts and the agreements and whatever nitty-gritty is signed. Do you think that in terms of Chinese loans and debt relief and suspension as it may be, would we ever consider having Africa come to the table with China as a bloc and negotiating? Do you think that's something that could ever possibly happen?
It could be a bad idea. But the problem is you have so many diverse different groups with different interests. And like I said earlier, you have some of these loans where people are taking kickbacks before even taking the loans from China. So different interests, some people are compromised. So it's going to be a tough one. But I think it's something that they should actually consider. and try and see. So basically look at all the countries that China has given loans to within Africa, and everybody comes together as a bloc and tries to negotiate eventually. It helps put some weight and put some pressure on them, because you come in as a bloc and come in as a group.
Makes sense. All right, so we'll be wrapping up in just a bit, but let's look at this. An article in The Diplomat stated that China seems to be considering a policy shift from lending to governments to lending to private firms. What do you think about this?
So basically the people are looking at Nigeria and what a lot of people have always touted as a way for infrastructural development. Let's get the private sector involved. Private sector will be more prepared to be able to ensure that they carry out this particular project. And then you would have less of the kickbacks that you see from politicians, government officials, and politicians interference from politicians. So it definitely does make sense to get the private sector involved. And also you would also help grow the private sector and the manufacturing capabilities of those various countries, right? Which, unlike where you have a scenario where China is the only one carrying out those projects, you now start to get the private sector involved. So it makes a lot of sense.
Okay, so we'll have to end the conversation here because of time. Thank you so much, Nnamdi Nwizu, co-managing partner, Comercio Partners, for joining me as we looked at China's Belt and Road Initiative and the prospects that the debt that China has taken on, I don't know if we say taken on, or the loans that China has given out, rather, could be slowing down the country's economic development. Thank you so much for joining me on the show.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
All right, so we look forward to seeing you again. All right, so you know what we do next? We wrap up the show with NC4 to watch. Here are a few stories we're keeping our eyes on. Africa's new free trade area should complete their tariff reduction schedules and finalize essential rules of origin by July, according to a senior official with the bloc's secretariat. African countries began officially trading under the African Continental Free Trade Area on January the 1st after months of delays caused by the global coronavirus pandemic. Experts, however, say full implementation of the deal will likely take years. Moving on from there, the aviation sector suffered setbacks due to the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 as the lockdown affected many countries and led to travel restrictions, reduced revenue, and mass loss of jobs. In the case of Nigeria, operators in the sector felt the impact of the pandemic more than their counterparts, as old illnesses suffered by the airlines were aggravated by the pandemic and left the operators wiggling in pain. The National Treasury will include 3.4 trillion Kenyan shillings in its national debt, owing to the International Monetary Fund's pressure on public debt disclosure. This move will push Kenya's national debt past the 9 trillion Kenyan shillings ceiling to 10.5 trillion Kenyan shillings. Currently, Kenya's public borrowing stands at 7.1 trillion Kenyan shillings. According to data from the Central Bank of Kenya, the country's public debt grew by 0.8 trillion Kenyan shillings to 7.1 trillion Kenyan shillings between March 2020 and January 2021. And finally, Tanzania's national debt, currently at 71.4 trillion Tanzanian shillings, is increasing, and the central bank says the dollar's depreciation against other currencies in which the debt is denominated is to blame, particularly the special drawing rights. According to the latest Bank of Tanzania's monthly economic review for December 2020, external debt stock was $23.8 billion at the end of November 2020, representing an increase of $145.5 million from October 2020 and $1.496 million from November 2019. However, despite the increase, the Ministry of Finance spokesperson said that the debt is still sustainable and indicative of the fact that the present value of public debt to GDP ratio remains favorable. And that's it on this edition of Business Edge. Please don't forget to follow us on social media. We are at News Central TV. Head over to our website and download our mobile app on Play Store and iOS. Until next time, I'm Tolulope Adeleru Balogun.